The words that tumbled from Senator John Kennedy's lips about Jesus Christ sent shockwaves through his own body, causing the seasoned Louisiana politician to collapse right there on the live stage before 3,000 stunned witnesses. What he declared in that moment would spread like wildfire across social media, reaching millions within hours and forever changing how America viewed this sharp-tongued conservative fighter. But nobody in that packed Baton Rouge auditorium could have predicted the extraordinary chain of events his testimony would unleash. The audience gasped collectively as Senator Kennedy remained on his knees, his head bowed in what appeared to be spontaneous prayer. Security personnel started moving toward the stage, but Kennedy's chief of staff, Marcus Thompson, held up his hand to stop them. Something profound was happening that went far beyond a typical political rally. The senator's shoulders shook with emotion as he stayed in that position of humble surrender. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a cardiologist attending the event with her teenage daughter, instinctively started toward the stage. She had seen Kennedy speak dozens of times at Louisiana political events, but never like this. The man known for his quick one-liners and folksy humor was experiencing something deeply spiritual before thousands of witnesses. Her medical training told her to help, but something deeper told her to wait and watch. Kennedy slowly lifted his head, his eyes glistening with tears that reflected the stage lights. He looked out at the crowd with an expression of wonder and gratitude that transformed his entire demeanor. "Forgive me, folks," he said softly into the microphone, his Louisiana drawl thick with emotion. "The Lord just touched my heart in a way I wasn't expecting." The auditorium remained completely silent, hanging on every word. Marcus Thompson had worked for Kennedy for 7 years and had never seen his boss display such raw vulnerability. This was the same man who had grilled Supreme Court nominees with razor-sharp precision, who had faced down Washington's most powerful politicians without flinching. Yet here he was, on his knees before God and thousands of people, completely surrendered to something greater than himself. Marcus felt his own eyes beginning to water. The event had been planned as a routine campaign-style rally in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Kennedy was supposed to discuss his latest legislative initiatives and take questions from constituents. But something had shifted dramatically when a young woman in the third row had asked him about his faith. Her simple question about Jesus had triggered something deep within the senator's soul that he couldn't contain or control. "You asked me about Jesus," Kennedy continued, slowly rising to his feet but remaining humble in his posture. His voice carried throughout the silent auditorium with remarkable clarity. "I've known the Lord most of my life, been baptized in the muddy waters of the Mississippi River when I was 12 years old. But tonight, he just reminded me why he passed on that cross." The crowd remained captivated by his transparent honesty. The young woman who had asked the question, 22-year-old Emma Broussard, sat stunned in her seat. She had simply wanted to know how Kennedy's faith influenced his political decisions. She never expected her innocent question to trigger such a powerful response from the seasoned politician. Emma clutched her grandmother's worn Bible, the same one that had prompted her to ask about faith in the first place. Emma's grandmother, Mama Evangeline, had raised her after her parents passed away in a car accident when she was 8. The elderly Cajun woman had instilled in Emma a deep love for Jesus and a belief that faith could move mountains. Before coming to the rally, Mama had told Emma to ask Senator Kennedy about his relationship with Christ. "Sometimes God uses young voices to reach powerful hearts," she had said. Kennedy walked closer to the edge of the stage, his usual confident swagger replaced by something gentler and more profound. "That young lady asked me how Jesus influences my work in Washington," he said, pointing toward Emma. "I thought I knew the answer, but the Lord just showed me I've been missing something important. I've been fighting battles up there, but I forgot who the real battle belongs to." The stage lights seemed to soften around Kennedy as he continued speaking from his heart rather than from prepared remarks. Television cameras from 3 local news stations captured every moment, though their operators hardly knew what they were witnessing. This wasn't political theater or campaign strategy. This was a genuine encounter with the divine happening in real time before their lenses and microphones. I've spent years in Washington trying to fix things with my own strength, Kennedy confessed, his voice growing stronger with each word. Sharp words, clever arguments, political maneuvering. But tonight, Jesus reminded me that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. The real power comes from surrendering to him, not from fighting in my own strength. The crowd began to stir with quiet murmurs of agreement. Dr. Mitchell found herself deeply moved by Kennedy's words. As someone who saved lives daily in the operating room, she understood the weight of responsibility and the temptation to rely solely on human skill and knowledge. Hearing this powerful politician acknowledge his need for divine guidance resonated with her own struggles to balance professional competence with spiritual humility. Her daughter squeezed her hand, sensing the moment's significance. Marcus Thompson remembered the conversation he'd had with Kennedy just 3 hours earlier in the car. The senator had seemed unusually quiet and reflective, mentioning that he'd been praying about his role in Washington and whether he was truly serving God's purposes. Marcus had assumed it was just typical pre-event nerves. Now he realized God had been preparing Kennedy's heart for this very moment. The senator's voice took on a deeper resonance as he continued his impromptu testimony. "You know, I've always been proud of my quick wit and sharp tongue. Folks back home expect me to give those Washington elites a piece of my mind, and I do. But Jesus just whispered to my heart that love is more powerful than clever words." His Louisiana accent became more pronounced as emotion deepened his connection to his roots. Emma Broussard felt tears forming in her eyes as she watched this powerful man humble himself before God and the crowd. This was exactly what Mama Evangeline had prayed for. Not just that politicians would claim faith, but that they would genuinely encounter Jesus in a way that transformed their hearts and actions. Emma began quietly praying that others would be touched by what they were witnessing tonight. Kennedy walked to the other side of the stage, his movement deliberate and purposeful, rather than his usual energetic pacing. "I want to tell y'all something that happened to me last week," he said, his voice carrying a storyteller's cadence that drew the audience deeper into his narrative. "I was in my office late at night, frustrated about a bill I'd been working on, when I opened my desk drawer and saw my daddy's old Bible." The senator paused, collecting himself as memories flooded back. His father, John Kennedy Sr., had been a man of deep faith who had taught his son to pray before every meal and read scripture before bed. But somewhere in the ambition and complexity of political life, those simple practices had been pushed aside for more urgent demands. The Bible had remained in his desk drawer, largely forgotten until that night. If you've ever felt distant from God, but want to return to him like Kennedy did, comment the words, "I believe," below. "My daddy gave me that Bible when I graduated from law school," Kennedy continued, his voice thick with emotion. "He wrote in the front cover, 'Son, all the education in the world can't replace what God teaches through his word.' I thought I was honoring his memory by working hard and fighting for conservative values, but I realize now I was missing the most important part, actually walking with Jesus daily." The audience was completely captivated by Kennedy's vulnerability and honesty. Many had come expecting political red meat and partisan rallying cries. Instead, they were witnessing a genuine spiritual awakening that transcended party lines and political calculations. Several people in the crowd began quietly praying, sensing that they were witnessing something historically significant that would impact far more than just Louisiana politics. Dr. Mitchell thought about her own father, also a man of deep faith who had influenced her early spiritual formation. Like Kennedy, she had let professional demands crowd out the simple practices of prayer and Bible reading that had once anchored her daily routine. Watching this senator rediscover his spiritual roots challenged her to examine her own relationship with Christ and consider what changes she might need to make. Kennedy's chief of staff discreetly checked his phone and saw that video clips of the senator's emotional moment were already being shared across social media platforms. News outlets were beginning to pick up the story, with headlines forming about the emotional breakdown or surprising religious display. But Marcus knew this wasn't a breakdown. It was a breakthrough that would likely change everything about how Kennedy approached his work. That night in my office, Kennedy continued, I opened Daddy's Bible for the first time in months. It fell open to Matthew 11, where Jesus says, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." Those words hit me like lightning. I've been laboring so hard, carrying burdens that were never mine to carry in the first place. His voice cracked slightly as he recalled the moment. The senator looked directly at Emma Broussard as he continued his story. I sat there reading that passage over and over, and I started to cry like I haven't cried since my daddy's funeral 15 years ago. All the anger, all the frustration, all the weight I'd been carrying trying to save this country in my own strength, Jesus was offering to take it all. The young woman nodded encouragingly, her own eyes filled with tears. Emma remembered her grandmother's words about how God often works through the most unexpected circumstances to reach hearts that have grown hard or distracted. Mama Evangeline always said that the Lord would use anyone willing to be used, regardless of their position or power. Watching Senator Kennedy's transparent confession, Emma felt overwhelmed by the privilege of witnessing God's grace in action before thousands of people. I stayed in that office until 3 a.m, Kennedy revealed, reading scripture and praying like I hadn't prayed since I was a boy. The Lord showed me that all my clever arguments and political strategies were just human wisdom. Paul says in 1 Corinthians that God's wisdom looks foolish to the world, but it's more powerful than anything man can devise. The crowd hung on every word of his testimony. Dr. Mitchell found herself thinking about her medical practice and how often she relied solely on scientific knowledge, while neglecting the spiritual dimension of healing. Kennedy's words about human wisdom versus God's wisdom challenged her to consider how she might better integrate her faith with her profession. She squeezed her daughter's hand, both of them sensing that this moment would impact their family's spiritual journey. Marcus Thompson had been raised in a Baptist church, but had drifted from faith during his political career. Watching his boss experience such a profound spiritual awakening stirred something in his own soul that had been dormant for years. He began mentally reviewing his own relationship with Christ, wondering if he too had substituted political activism for genuine spiritual devotion and surrender to God's will. Kennedy wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, his emotional transparency creating an atmosphere of sacred intimacy despite the large crowd. "I want y'all to know that I'm not the same man who walked onto this stage tonight," he declared with growing confidence. "Jesus didn't just touch my heart, he changed it. From now on, everything I do in Washington will be filtered through one question: what would Jesus do?" The auditorium erupted in spontaneous applause, but Kennedy raised his hand for quiet. This wasn't about political approval or campaign momentum. This was about a genuine spiritual transformation that demanded reverent attention rather than partisan celebration. The crowd quickly settled back into respectful silence, sensing that something sacred was still unfolding before their eyes and in their own hearts. "I know some of y'all are wondering if this is just political theater," Kennedy said with a slight smile that carried both humor and sincerity. "Trust me, if I was going to stage something for votes, I wouldn't choose to cry in front of 3,000 people and however many watching on television. This is real, folks. Jesus is real, and he just met me right here on this stage in Baton Rouge, Louisiana." Emma Broussard felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude wash over her as she realized God had used her simple question to create this moment of divine encounter. She thought about all the people watching on television and social media who might be touched by Senator Kennedy's testimony. Mama Evangeline had always said that when God moves, he makes sure the whole world has a chance to see his glory. The senator's demeanor had completely transformed from the beginning of the evening. Gone was the combative political fighter, replaced by a man radiating peace and humility. "I've been angry for so long," he confessed. "Angry at politicians who don't share my values. Angry at a culture that seems to reject everything I hold dear. But tonight, Jesus reminded me that anger isn't my calling. Love is." Dr. Mitchell thought about her own struggles with anger and frustration in her medical practice, dealing with insurance companies, bureaucratic regulations, and sometimes difficult patience had hardened her heart in ways she hadn't fully recognized. Kennedy's words about choosing love over anger challenged her to examine her own attitudes and consider how Christ might want to transform her approach to daily challenges. Kennedy walked back to center stage, his movements now carrying a sense of purpose and peace that hadn't been there earlier. "The young lady who asked me about Jesus, would you please stand up?" he requested, looking toward Emma Broussard. The crowd turned to see the shy young woman slowly rise from her seat, her face flushed with embarrassment, but glowing with joy at what her question had prompted. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Kennedy asked with grandfatherly warmth that revealed a gentler side of his personality that few had ever seen publicly. His political persona was known for sharp wit and fearless confrontation, but this moment revealed the tender heart that lay beneath the tough exterior. Emma's voice trembled as she answered, "Emma Broussard, sir. I'm from Lafayette." Kennedy nodded appreciatively. "Emma from Lafayette, you asked me how Jesus influences my work in Washington. I thought I knew the answer. But the Lord used your question to show me how much I've been trying to do in my own strength instead of His. You've been His messenger tonight, young lady, and I want to thank you for your courage to ask about faith in a political setting." Emma felt overwhelmed by the senator's gracious response to her question. She had been nervous about speaking up in such a large crowd, but her grandmother's encouragement and her own genuine curiosity about faith in politics had given her courage. Now she realized that God had used her simple inquiry to create a moment that would touch thousands of lives and potentially transform a powerful politician's approach to his calling. The television cameras continued rolling as Kennedy addressed Emma directly. "I want you to know that your question changed my life tonight," he said with deep sincerity. "Sometimes God uses the youngest voices to reach the oldest hearts. You reminded me that being a Christian in Washington isn't about winning political battles. It's about representing Jesus Christ with humility, love, and genuine concern for others." Marcus Thompson discreetly coordinated with security to ensure that the extended program wouldn't create any safety issues, but he could see that the crowd was completely engaged and peaceful. Many people were quietly praying or wiping tears from their eyes. This wasn't the typical raucous political rally with cheering and chanting. It had become something more like a church service or revival meeting. "I want to tell y'all what the Lord showed me about anger versus love," Kennedy continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had just received fresh revelation. When Jesus cleared the temple, he wasn't acting out of personal frustration or political calculation. He was moved by love for his Father's house and compassion for people being exploited. There's a difference between righteous anger and self-righteous anger. Dr. Mitchell found herself taking mental notes about the distinction Kennedy was making. In her medical practice, she sometimes felt angry about systemic problems that hurt patients, but she realized she often let that anger become personal frustration rather than channeling it into constructive action motivated by love. Kennedy's spiritual insight was applicable far beyond politics. It spoke to anyone trying to balance passion for justice with Christ-like character. The senator's voice grew stronger as he continued exploring the revelation he had received. "I've been fighting battles in Washington with self-righteous anger, trying to prove I was right, instead of trying to love people into truth. Jesus didn't come to condemn the world, but to save it. If I'm representing him, shouldn't my approach reflect his heart, rather than my own pride and frustration?" Emma Broussard felt tears streaming down her face as she listened to Kennedy's transformation unfold in real time. This was exactly what her grandmother had prayed for. Not just that politicians would claim faith as a political tool, but that they would genuinely encounter Jesus in a way that changed their hearts and methods. She began praying that other political leaders would witness this testimony and be challenged to examine their own approaches. Kennedy looked out over the crowd with new eyes, seeing not just political supporters or opponents, but souls created in God's image. "I realize now that every person I deal with in Washington, whether they agree with me or not, is someone Jesus passed away for," he said with growing conviction. That changes everything about how I should approach my work. It's not about winning, it's about loving people toward truth. The audience seemed to sense that they were witnessing a defining moment, not just in Kennedy's life, but potentially in American politics. Several people began quietly sharing the live stream on their phones, knowing that others needed to witness this genuine display of spiritual transformation. The hashtag Kennedy Encounters Jesus began trending on social media as word spread about what was happening in Baton Rouge. Marcus Thompson checked his phone again and saw that major news networks were now picking up the story. Cable news channels were cutting into regular programming to show clips of Kennedy's emotional testimony. Political commentators were scrambling to analyze what this might mean for his career and influence, but Marcus knew they were missing the point entirely. This wasn't about politics. It was about the power of authentic faith. "I want to share something else the Lord revealed to me," Kennedy said, his voice carrying increasing confidence in his spiritual discoveries. "I've been so focused on fighting against things I disagree with that I forgot to fight for the people Jesus loves. Every policy, every debate, every vote should be filtered through one question: how does this demonstrate Christ's love for hurting people?" Dr. Mitchell thought about her own tendency to focus on problems rather than solutions, on fighting against systemic issues rather than working constructively for healing and hope. Kennedy's insight about fighting for people rather than against ideas resonated deeply with her medical calling and her desire to integrate faith more fully into her daily work and relationships. Kennedy walked to the front edge of the stage and sat down, his legs dangling over the side like a child on a porch. This informal posture removed the last barriers between him and the audience, creating an atmosphere of intimate conversation rather than political speech. "I want to tell y'all about a vote I cast last month that I now realize was wrong," he said with remarkable vulnerability. The crowd leaned forward, curious about this unprecedented level of political transparency and spiritual honesty. Politicians rarely admitted mistakes, especially not in such public settings. But Kennedy seemed completely free from the usual calculations about image and career implications. This was a man speaking from a transformed heart rather than from political strategy or public relations concerns. There was a bill that would have provided additional funding for mental health services in rural communities, Kennedy explained. "I voted against it because it had some provisions I disagreed with philosophically. But tonight, Jesus showed me that while I was being philosophically pure, real people were suffering. Sometimes loving people means finding ways to help even when the solution isn't perfect." Emma Broussard was amazed by Kennedy's willingness to publicly acknowledge a mistake and commit to a different approach. This level of humility from a powerful politician seemed almost impossible, yet she was witnessing it happen in real time. Her grandmother had always said that true repentance involved not just feeling sorry, but changing direction, and that's exactly what she was seeing unfold. Mitchell appreciated Kennedy's recognition that philosophical purity sometimes conflicted with practical compassion. In her medical practice, she sometimes had to work within imperfect systems to help patients rather than waiting for ideal conditions. Kennedy's spiritual insight about prioritizing love for people over ideological consistency challenged her own thinking about work and life decisions. "I called my staff tonight before coming here," Kennedy continued, "and told them to draft a new version of that mental health bill. I'm going to reach across the aisle and work with Democrats to find common ground on helping people, even if it means compromising on some secondary issues." Jesus cared more about healing people than winning political points. Marcus Thompson was frantically taking notes about the policy commitments Kennedy was making spontaneously. This wasn't part of any planned political strategy, which made it both authentic and potentially problematic from a traditional campaign management perspective. But watching his boss experience genuine spiritual transformation, Marcus realized that conventional political wisdom might not apply to what was happening here. The senator's eyes sparkled with joy as he continued sharing his revelations. "The Lord also showed me something about my opponents," he said with a smile that carried no trace of his usual political combativeness. They're not enemies to be defeated. They're people to be loved. I may disagree with their policies, but I need to remember that they're trying to help people too, just from a different perspective. Kennedy stood up and walked back to the microphone stand, his posture reflecting new confidence rooted in spiritual rather than political authority. I want to publicly apologize to some folks I've been too harsh with, he announced. Senator Elizabeth Warren, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and several others. I may disagree with their approaches, but I've questioned their motives and attacked their character instead of engaging their ideas with respect and love. The crowd stirred with surprise at these unexpected apologies to prominent Democratic politicians. This wasn't typical Republican rally rhetoric, and many weren't sure how to respond. But Kennedy's genuine humility and evident spiritual transformation created space for people to consider whether their own political engagement might need similar course corrections rooted in Christ-like love rather than partisan hostility. Emma Broussard felt overwhelmed with gratitude as she watched Kennedy model the kind of political leadership her grandmother had always prayed for. Someone willing to put Christian character above partisan advantage. This was the difference between using faith as a political tool and actually following Jesus in public life. She began praying that other leaders would be inspired by Kennedy's example to examine their own approaches. Dr. Mitchell was struck by Kennedy's willingness to name specific people and apologize publicly. This level of vulnerability and accountability was rare in any profession, but especially in politics, where admitting mistakes was often seen as weakness. Yet Kennedy's spiritual courage made him appear stronger rather than weaker, demonstrating the paradoxical power of gospel-centered humility. I know some of y'all are wondering what this means for my future in politics, Kennedy said, addressing the elephant in the room with characteristic directness. I'm not sure yet. What I know is that from now on, everything I do will be measured against one standard. Does this honor Jesus Christ and demonstrate his love for people? If the answer is no, I won't do it, regardless of the political consequences. Marcus Thompson realized that Kennedy's spiritual transformation would likely create significant challenges for his political career. The senator's new commitment to Christ-like love and humility might not play well with donors who expected partisan warfare and media outlets that thrived on political conflict. But watching the peace radiating from his boss's face, Marcus understood that some things were more important than traditional political success. Kennedy looked directly into the television cameras, seeming to sense that his message needed to reach far beyond the Baton Rouge auditorium. To anyone watching this who holds political office, he said with prophetic intensity, I want to challenge you to ask yourself whether you're truly representing Jesus Christ or just using his name for political advantage. The difference matters, and the people we serve deserve leaders who actually follow the Prince of Peace. The senator's voice took on an even more passionate tone as he continued his challenge to fellow politicians. We've turned politics into a war where the goal is crushing our opponents rather than serving our constituents. But Jesus calls us to love our enemies, to pray for those who persecute us, to be peacemakers. What would happen if Christians in politics actually lived like Christians? Emma Broussard felt a sense of prophetic significance as Kennedy continued his challenge to political leaders across the nation. This wasn't just one senator having a spiritual experience. This felt like a moment that could catalyze broader transformation in how faith-filled people approached public service. She began praying that God would use this testimony to reach politicians in both parties who claimed Christian faith. Kennedy's voice grew quieter but more intense as he prepared to share what seemed to be the climax of his spiritual revelation. The Lord showed me something else tonight that I need to share with y'all, he said, his eyes glistening with fresh tears. He reminded me that this country doesn't need more political warriors. It needs more disciples of Jesus Christ who happen to serve in government. Dr. Mitchell felt her heart racing as she sensed that Kennedy was about to share something even more profound than what he had already revealed. The entire auditorium seemed to hold its breath, recognizing that they were approaching the culmination of an extraordinary spiritual encounter that would likely impact far more people than those physically present in the room. Kennedy's voice broke with emotion as he reached the heart of what Jesus had revealed to him. "The Lord showed me that He's raising up a new generation of leaders who will put His kingdom ahead of party politics," he declared, his words carrying prophetic weight. "Not Republicans or Democrats first, but disciples of Jesus Christ, who will work together to heal this nation with His love instead of dividing it with our pride." The senator fell to his knees again, this time in deliberate worship rather than overwhelming emotion. "Jesus, I surrender my political career to You," he prayed aloud into the microphone. "Use me however You want, even if it means losing elections or disappointing supporters. I choose Your approval over human applause, Your wisdom over political strategy, Your love over partisan victory." The crowd remained completely silent, sensing the sacred nature of this moment. As Kennedy prayed, something extraordinary began happening throughout the auditorium. People started spontaneously moving toward the stage, not as fans seeking autographs, but as souls drawn by the presence of God that had filled the room. Dr. Mitchell found herself walking forward with her daughter, tears streaming down both their faces as they sensed divine invitation to surrender their own lives more fully to Christ. Emma Broussard watched in amazement as hundreds of people began gathering near the stage, many kneeling in prayer or raising their hands in worship. This political rally had become a spontaneous revival service, with Senator Kennedy serving as an unexpected evangelist whose transparency about his own spiritual transformation was touching hearts throughout the room and beyond through television and social media. Marcus Thompson abandoned his usual role as political handler and joined those moving toward the stage. He knelt beside an elderly farmer and a young college student, all of them united in responding to the same divine call to deeper discipleship. The barriers of age, race, and social status dissolved in the presence of Jesus Christ, creating the kind of unity that Kennedy had spoken about as God's vision for political leadership. Kennedy lifted his head and saw the crowd gathering around the stage. His eyes widened with wonder and gratitude as he realized that his personal encounter with Jesus had become a catalyst for broader spiritual awakening. "Lord Jesus," he whispered into the microphone, "You're doing something bigger than I ever imagined. Thank You for using my broken pride to reveal Your perfect love." The senator stood and surveyed the scene before him with deep humility and awe. "Folks, I don't think this is about me anymore," he said softly. "I think Jesus is calling all of us to something higher than politics as usual. He's inviting us to be part of healing this nation through love instead of dividing it through anger. Who's ready to answer that call with me?" A spontaneous chorus of yes erupted from the crowd, followed by voices joining together in singing Amazing Grace. The song started with just a few voices but quickly grew to include most of the 3,000 people present. Television cameras captured the extraordinary scene as political divisions melted away in the presence of Christ's unifying love, creating footage that would soon be viewed by millions. Dr. Mitchell found herself singing alongside strangers who felt like family, her medical expertise and social status completely irrelevant in this moment of shared surrender to Jesus Christ. She thought about how this experience would change her approach to patient care, her relationships with colleagues, and her family's spiritual life. Kennedy's courage to be vulnerable had given her permission to examine her own need for spiritual transformation. Emma Broussard looked around the auditorium with tears of joy as she witnessed the fruit of her simple question about faith. Her grandmother's prayers for political leaders to encounter Jesus genuinely had been answered in spectacular fashion. But more than that, Emma sensed that this moment was just the beginning of something that would spread far beyond this single event to touch countless lives across the nation. As the singing continued, Kennedy raised his hands in worship alongside everyone else, no longer a political figure on a stage, but simply another disciple of Jesus Christ, joining in corporate praise. The transformation was complete, from political warrior to humble servant, from self-reliant fighter to surrendered follower. The man who had collapsed emotionally at the beginning of the evening now stood transformed by divine grace, ready to serve Christ rather than his own ambitions. As the spontaneous worship service gradually concluded, Kennedy addressed the crowd one final time with a voice full of peace and gratitude. "Thank y'all for witnessing my encounter with Jesus tonight," he said humbly. "I came here planning to talk politics, but the Lord had other plans. He wanted to remind all of us that His love is greater than our divisions, His grace is stronger than our failures, and His purposes will prevail over our pride." Dr. Mitchell approached the stage with her daughter, both of them transformed by what they had witnessed and experienced. "Senator Kennedy," she said, "thank you for your courage to be vulnerable. You've shown us what authentic faith in public life looks like. My daughter and I will be praying for you as you walk out this new commitment to follow Jesus first." Kennedy smiled warmly and thanked them for their encouragement and prayers. Emma Broussard also made her way to the stage, still amazed that her simple question had triggered such an extraordinary spiritual encounter. Kennedy saw her approaching and immediately came over to thank her personally. "Young lady, God used your courage to ask about faith to change my life and touch thousands of others," he said with deep gratitude. Never underestimate how the Lord can use willing hearts, regardless of age or position. Marcus Thompson coordinated with event staff to ensure that people could leave safely and that media interviews could be arranged for those interested in sharing their experiences. He was already fielding calls from news networks wanting to interview Kennedy about his transformation, but the senator insisted that any media appearances focus on Jesus Christ rather than on political implications or career consequences. As the auditorium gradually emptied, Kennedy spent time praying with individuals and families who wanted to share their own spiritual commitments, inspired by his testimony. He no longer seemed like a political figure managing constituents, but rather like a pastor caring for souls. The evening that had begun as a political rally had become a divine encounter that would ripple outward to impact countless lives across Louisiana and beyond. In the days following Kennedy's extraordinary testimony, video clips of his spiritual transformation went viral across social media platforms, reaching millions of viewers who had never heard of the Louisiana senator. News outlets struggled to categorize the event. Was it political theater, genuine religious experience, or calculated campaign strategy? But those who had been present knew they had witnessed authentic divine intervention that transcended human understanding or manipulation. Emma Broussard received calls from national media outlets wanting to interview the young woman whose question had triggered Kennedy's spiritual breakthrough. But following her grandmother's wisdom about staying humble when God uses you for His purposes, Emma politely declined most interviews while continuing to pray for the senator and others who had been touched by the evening's events. She trusted that God's work would continue without her needing to seek spotlight or credit. Dr. Mitchell found that her encounter with authentic faith in action revolutionized her approach to medical practice. She began praying with patients who were open to it, treating colleagues with greater compassion, and integrating her Christian worldview more intentionally into her professional life. Kennedy's example of surrendering pride and control to Jesus Christ had given her courage to live out her own faith more boldly and genuinely. Marcus Thompson decided to leave political consulting to pursue seminary training, inspired by witnessing the power of authentic spiritual leadership versus mere political maneuvering. He realized that his skills in communication and organization could serve God's kingdom more effectively than partisan politics. Kennedy's transformation had shown him that there were higher callings than winning elections or advancing political careers through conventional worldly wisdom. Senator Kennedy began each day with extended prayer and Bible reading, seeking God's guidance for every decision and interaction in Washington. His approach to legislation, debates, and relationships with colleagues reflected his new commitment to represent Jesus Christ rather than just conservative ideology. Some criticized him for being less combative, but others noted increased effectiveness in building coalitions and actually passing meaningful legislation through Christ-like humility and love. If you're watching this story today, perhaps God is calling you to examine your own life for areas where pride has replaced surrender, where anger has crowded out love, where human wisdom has taken precedence over divine guidance. Senator Kennedy's transformation reminds us that it's never too late to humble ourselves before Jesus Christ and allow Him to redirect our paths toward His purposes. What would happen if you had the courage to collapse before Christ tonight, surrendering your own plans for His perfect will? Subscribe for more stories of faith transforming lives, and share in the comments below how God has been working in your own life or what this story means to you. The same Jesus who met Kennedy on that stage in Baton Rouge is waiting to meet you wherever you are, ready to transform your heart and redirect your life toward His greater purposes.